President Joe Biden was supposed to make an historic trip to Papua New Guinea next week, but he has scrapped that visit and his meeting in Sydney with the Quad grouping to return to Washington for negotiations on the debt ceiling. The US, Japan, India, Australia talks will now happen on the sidelines of the G7 summit that starts tomorrow. The cancellation of that trip down under, more of a blip though than a blemish for the Quad, as Roger Maynard finds out.
The world-famous Sydney Opera House was to provide the picture-perfect setting for the Quad summit. However, in view of President Biden's absence, organisers had little choice but to call it off. There were even last-minute plans for him to address both houses of Parliament in Canberra, as well as talks with South Pacific leaders in neighbouring Papua New Guinea. The entire programme put on ice. But this is not to detract from the growing influence of the Quad and the importance Australia places on the alliance with Japan, India and the United States.
The Quad is very important for Australia. It's been embraced by both sides of politics, by both major political parties in Australia as part of the Indo-Pacific security architecture. It provides a kind of network for us in the region that is not simply about dependence on the United States or indeed, if you like, capitulating to Chinese influence. So the Quad proves that Australia can do smart diplomacy as a middle power with democratic partners, but in a way that stabilises the region.
Former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who played a key role in helping to forge the Quad, called it one of the most important advances in Australia's security since Canberra signed an alliance with the United States.
That's a very strong statement. I'm not sure the current government would go quite so far, but it's very important in terms of enmeshing the role of the US in the region, achieving greater convergence with India and also partnering with Japan.
Australia's role in the Quad also reflects its growing assertiveness in the region.
I think it's unarguable Australia has become more assertive. It didn't want to, but was forced to by the fact that from 2017 onwards it started to resist Chinese intrusions into its system. That was followed up by a more assertive, if you like, defence stance with the AUKUS agreement with the US and UK. The continuation of the Quad is simply a reassurance that it's not losing its nerve.
While Australia won't be hosting the Quad summit after all, analysts believe the cancellation is likely to have little influence on the alliance in the long term.
Even China is beginning to accept that the Quad is here to stay, and it's been quite reassuring for me as an Australian analyst watching the attitudes of elites within ASEAN in recent years, is that there's an increasing acceptance that the Quad is part of that multipolarity of the region, that many-sided nature of regional diplomacy that can put limits on Chinese power without provoking conflict.
Even so, there are fears President Biden's no-show in Sydney could undermine Australia's faith in its relationship with the United States, with local media here reporting that the cancellation might raise questions about the reliability of the US as a regional ally. Roger Maynard, CNA, Sydney.
For more on US President Joe Biden's Asia trip, Chong Jia-Ian, Associate Professor at the National University of Singapore, joins us live. Professor, we just heard that Australia generally downplaying any damage from the cancellation of this trip by Mr. Biden to both Papua New Guinea as well as Australia. But of course, if we look at state-linked media, Chinese Global Times, I quote the headline article, Biden skips 2 legs of trip, erodes US credibility. This stated unequivocally. Now, leaving aside the understandable schadenfreude of that kind of headline, how would you rate the damage? Is it substantial? Is it unfixable, this cancellation of trips to both these places?
I think it's fixable, but the effects on both places are a bit different. The Quad, it's a little bit more mature. There's a little bit more momentum going in. So there, I think whatever fallout would be quite limited. With Papua New Guinea, given the fact that the U.S. initiative towards the Pacific and also towards Southeast Asia is perhaps less formed, and certainly the part with the Pacific is a little bit newer. So the no-show there, and even a sort of sending of Deputy Blinken there, Secretary Blinken, that would send signals of perhaps questions over U.S. commitment or the reliability or the ability of the U.S. to really show up for the long term. So I think there probably needs to be more bolstering up, meaning Papua New Guinea and the Pacific.
So these trips that, of course, in the media we would emphasize, and they are headline stories, how much weight do they actually carry? So in this instance of the U.S. visit to Papua New Guinea, apparently a whole troop of American executives were to have accompanied President Biden on this trip to bring investment to, let's face it, a country that does need a lot of infrastructure investment. If China comes along offering that kind of development money, the States really stands to lose out in comparison.
So there are two elements to that. One is, of course, the back and forth among business and political leaders and also diplomats. That side is a little bit less seen, but the face-to-face contact will, of course, open up opportunities. It may open up pathways for future discovery of cooperation. The other point is the physical presence that is seen on TV by the public in general. Now, that kind of presence, it shows a degree of commitment. It shows a willingness to take the time and make the effort to go down and meet people. It shows a certain commitment and presence. In short, I guess, showing up matters. And this is where the sort of public optics are quite important.
So very quickly, when in the Bush administration, Condoleezza Rice went in place of the president, or in the case of Barack Obama in 2013, sending someone else instead of himself, and Xi Jinping then taking center stage, these were serious damage. That was serious damage dealt then very quickly.
I mean, I don't know whether it was serious damage, but it certainly was a sense that the U.S. did not take as seriously these relationships as China. And so obviously Beijing took advantage of that position to show that they were there and they were interested in a way that the U.S. was perhaps less so.
All right, final question, Professor Chong. Going beyond immediate, rather superficial gloating on the part of the Global Times, a more serious Chinese analyst might look at this and think, for all the talk about bipartisan U.S. support in terms of policy on China, you would think the Republican Party might say, on this matter, let's give President Biden a pass, let him, for now, leave this debt issue aside, go to Asia and get foreign policy right. We'll leave this aside. But the fact that they did not and they are still intransigent, China would read this as there is no bipartisan support on policy in Asia.
Right. So this is something that's quite curious, right? You would think that it's Asia policy, China policy is supposed to be one of those places where there's bipartisan support. But it seems that the Republicans are unwilling to give way. This, of course, calls into question how committed the Republicans are to a bipartisan position that could potentially take the wind out of the sails a little bit of the U.S. position that can make the Biden administration's work a little bit harder. So, of course, it's domestic politics. I understand that. But this is where domestic politics may start tripping up foreign policy. And the question of intent, the question of commitment comes up again.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us this evening, Professor Chong Jia-en from the National University of Singapore.